Bonjour. What we're going to be looking at here in this video is the indirect object pronouns. And one thing I want to iterate and reiterate is that indirect object pronouns are much easier if you have a good grasp on what direct object pronouns are. So as we get into the video, into the little bit more explanation, we'll go back into that a little bit, then we'll move forward onto indirect object pronouns. If you're not sure about them, if you're still a little uncomfortable, feel free to go back and do some more practice with direct object pronouns, get in contact with me, and we can go over it some more. And that's about it. Best of luck. Si vous avez des questions, contactez-moi. Merci.
We're going to look at les pronoms objets indirects, but before we do that, we're going to take a quick peek back and go over one more time the direct object pronouns. And the reason we're doing this is because if you have a good understanding of direct object pronouns, indirect object pronouns come a lot more easily. They follow a lot of the same rules, and there's only a few differences that you'll have to keep an eye out for when you're working with them. So if we look at these two sentences, Caroline donne le livre à sa sœur. This first one, if we think about what is the direct object, what is the verb acting upon, Caroline gives her book to her sister. What is being given? It is le livre. And so when we replace that into the sentence, the le livre is going to be substituted with the direct object pronoun le. So we have Caroline le donne à sa sœur, if you just want to make a quick substitution for that. And the second one, this is a little bit more natural way that we'd use it if it's a question and an answer. Est-ce que tu peux expliquer la leçon à moi? And so what is being explained? It's la leçon. And so if we give an answer back for this one, oui, je peux l'expliquer à toi. So the L apostrophe is la, the direct object pronoun, replacing la leçon. And if we look at these same sentences, Caroline donne le livre à sa sœur, we have another element in there that's not being treated, and that's the à sa sœur. And then the second one, est-ce que tu peux expliquer la leçon à moi? We have the à moi that's not being treated as well. And so just a quick example, Caroline donne le livre. You may have seen something like this in the past. This lui is referring to à sa sœur. And then the same idea, oui, je peux t'expliquer la leçon. These are ways that we're going to be using the indirect objects. And as we move forward, we'll look at more where this lui and where the te comes from. But first, if we look at this sentence, we can break it down a little bit more. Grégoire lance le ballon à Pascal et Philippe. And so the very first thing we ask is, what is the subject, who's doing the action? Ça c'est Grégoire. Grégoire est le sujet. And what is Grégoire doing? He lance, so he's throwing, the verb lancer. And what is he throwing? And when we ask that question, what is the verb doing, to what is the verb acting, or upon what is it acting, that gives us the direct object. So l'objet direct, le ballon. What is he throwing? He is throwing the ball. And we have these other elements in the sentence, à Pascal et Philippe, and this is answering to whom is the ball being thrown. So these Pascal and Philippe, they're still part of the action, but they're not being thrown. They're having something thrown to them, so they're indirectly associated with the action. And we look for the actual substitutions. In the previous example we had Pascal and Philippe. They were involved in the action indirectly. And so when we look to see what are we going to use to replace them, we have these different possibilities. Me, te, lui, nous, vous, and leur. And hopefully one of the first things you catch on to is these top four examples. Me, te, nous, and vous. They're the exact same as what we had for the direct objects. The only differences we have is for the third persons when it's referring to him, her, or they. In which case, for him and her, we have lui. So masculine and feminine, it stays the same. And if it's plural, it's leur. And so that's something that's hopefully going to be make this a little bit easier on you as a learner. That really the only change you have to look out for is if it's happening to him, to her, it, or to them or to they. Which is great because if it's happening to me or to you, the moi, toi, the nous, the vous, it's always going to be the same. Me, te, nous, vous. So that's something to keep in mind. And just real quick, we're going to look at identifying direct and indirect object pronouns first. So we have François demande une question bête à sa femme. So what is our direct object? What is being asked? That is une question bête. And to whom is it being asked? That is à sa femme. We'll continue on a little bit faster. Nous passons la tranche de gâteau à mon frère. What is being passed? It is la tranche de gâteau. Now to whom is it being passed? That is à mon frère. So that shows us the direct and indirect object pronouns. For this third example, tu achètes un vieil ordinateur pour ton oncle Charles. Qu'est-ce qu'on achète? On achète un vieil ordinateur. Et pour qui est-ce qu'on achète l'ordinateur? On achète l'ordinateur pour ton oncle Charles. So that shows us the direct and indirect object pronouns, what's being bought and for whom. And the last example we have, ils ont envoyé une lettre à la directrice de l'entreprise. Qu'est-ce qu'ils ont envoyé? Une lettre, objet direct. Et à qui est-ce qu'ils ont envoyé la lettre? À la directrice de l'entreprise, l'objet indirect. So when we look at these different ones, and we can see what do all of these, or what do these indirect objects have in common, à sa femme, à mon frère, and then à la directrice de l'entreprise. These three examples all start with à. Then if we look at the third example, pour ton oncle Charles, that starts with pour. By and large, when you look at the indirect object pronouns when they're in the sentence, they are going to be introduced by à la, or o with an x on the end for the plural. And there are some exceptions, but they are always going to be introduced with a preposition, such as pour in this case. Most often it's going to be with the preposition à, though, showing that something is done to someone indirectly. And a quick note as well before we get into some practice. For the passé composé, or for the infinitives, this is going to follow the same rules that we had with the direct objects. So in the past, for direct objects, you would place the direct object pronoun just before the conjugated verb, which would be avoir or être. And for the infinitive, it's going to be placed just before the infinitive. And we see that in these two examples. Est-ce que tu as préparé le dîner pour les invités? And so les invités is plural. And you have the pour introducing it. So, oui, je leur ai préparé le dîner. Or if you have the negative, non, je ne leur ai pas préparé le dîner. Our second example, quand est-ce que vous allez téléphoner à l'agent de voyage? Nous allons lui téléphoner demain. So, à l'agent de voyage, the travel agent, that's a singular, so it's replaced by lui. We put that just before the infinitive. And then one last thing to point out. In these sentences that I've used, they often have a direct object and an indirect object. Neither of those are necessary for a complete sentence. You can have a complete coherent sentence with just a direct object or with just an indirect object, and that's perfectly fine. You can even have it with neither of those, and that works still as well. For practice, I have them both in there just so you can get comfortable with seeing them in there and identifying them next to each other. But just be aware that you can have very easily a sentence with just the direct object or just the indirect object. It just depends on the verbs that are being used and the message that is being conveyed. So if we look at these sentences for some practice, if you have a piece of paper handy, now's a good time to get it out to practice. This first question, you go ahead and give an appropriate answer to it. Est-ce que tu téléphones à tes grands-parents tous les week-ends? So we have tu téléphones à tes grands-parents. À tes grands-parents is our indirect object. And since it's à tes grands-parents, that's going to be replaced by the plural. Leur. Oui, je leur téléphone tous les week-ends. Or perhaps you do not call them every weekend, so that'd be non, je ne leur téléphone pas tous les week-ends. So we move on to the second example. Est-ce que les parents de Michel ont acheté une voiture pour Michel? So did they buy a car for him? We have the first possibility. Oui, ils lui ont acheté une voiture. And the second is if it's a negative. Non, ils ne lui ont pas acheté une voiture. Now is also a good time to note as well. In the passé composé, for the direct object pronouns, you would be required to make the past participle agree with the direct object pronoun. For indirect object pronouns, that is not the case. This celui could be referring to Michel masculine or Michel feminine. If it's feminine, if it were a direct object, you'd have to have that extra e in here. But since it's indirect, this does not have to agree back to that. So acheter without the e or s is what we're looking for. Our third example, je t'ai envoyé une carte postale, n'est-ce pas? And with this one, je t'ai envoyé, so I sent it to you, as we have that answer back. Oui, tu m'as envoyé une carte postale. And then, so if that were to be negative, non, tu ne m'as pas envoyé une carte postale. And our last question, est-ce que vous nous demandez d'être présent pour la cérémonie? So you're asking us to be present for the ceremony. And so what is being asked for our direct object is going to be present for the ceremony. That whole thing is the direct object. For the indirect, that's actually already substituted, much like that previous one. Vous nous demandez, so you're asking that of us. So we already have the substitution made, so when we answer, we just need to flip that around. Oui, nous vous demandons d'être présent pour la cérémonie, or of course the negative. Non, nous ne vous demandons pas d'être présent pour la cérémonie. So hopefully this has been helpful. Be sure to keep up with the practice that we have and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Merci.